political and economic arena of North America. Since the first minutes of Trump's second United States presidency, we hear Canada and the US more and more frequently, but contrary to what you might think, as a serious rival.
A Canada-U.S. trade battle has begun and the gloves are off.
U.S. President Donald Trump has signed tariffs on imports from Canada.
The intensifying trade war in the United States. Donald Trump has admitted Americans could feel pain in his trade war against Mexico and Canada.
U.S. President Donald Trump has signed an order to levy 25% tariffs on imports from Canada.
It's a back and forth that the Wall Street Journal editorial board is calling the dumbest trade war in history.
These two close neighbours of North America have a largely integrated economy and a long history of cooperation. So much so that millions of dollars worth of goods cross the border every day. And both countries are known as one of the most stable examples of commercial partnership. Recently, however, there has been a succession of moves that have sent ripples through this friendship. It all started when United States President Donald Trump announced tariffs of up to 25% on steel and aluminum imports from Canada. When this was first announced, many people thought, maybe Trump wants to create bargaining leverage again. Maybe he will back down in the future. After all, trade with Canada is also vital for the US, but the expected backtracking did not come. The White House continued to say, "This tariff decision is in effect. We intend to protect our own manufacturing industry." So how did Canada react? Prime Minister Justin Trudeau first tried diplomacy and backdoor talks to find a compromise with Washington. But it seems that Trump and his team did not give up their position that we expect Canada to submit to these tariffs. Eventually, Ottawa said, "We can't keep quiet about this." Ottawa responded with a fierce retaliatory move. Canada's retaliation is based on the so-called tit-for-tat logic, i.e., a quid pro quo. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has announced a 25% tariff on American products.
To the U.S. trade action, with 25% tariffs against $155 billion worth of American goods.
But how comprehensive is Canada's retaliation package? Has its full list been made public? Our video begins for the answers to our questions and more. A 25% tariff will be imposed on many products imported from the US. Trudeau said the tariffs would affect 155 billion Canadian dollars worth of American goods, from beer and wine to household appliances and sports equipment,
such as American beer, wine, and bourbon, fruits and fruit juices, including orange juice.
Tariffs will also be imposed on lumber and plastics, and non-tariff measures on critical minerals and supplies are also being considered. The Canadian Prime Minister announced that tariffs on 30 billion worth of US goods will take effect on Tuesday, February 4, with another 125 billion in tariffs to be imposed within 21 days. The Prime Minister added that Canadian companies will be given time to adapt. Addressing US citizens at a press conference in Ottawa, Trudeau said that tariffs on Canada will put your jobs at risk, potentially shutting down American auto assembly plants and other manufacturing facilities. Trudeau said Canada is considering non-tariff measures on critical minerals, energy supplies, and other partnerships. According to Canadian government data for 2023, the 9,000-kilometre US-Canada border hosts over $2.5 billion a day in trade, particularly in the energy and manufacturing sectors. In 2023, Canada exported about 550 billion Canadian dollars worth of goods and services to the United States. That was more than 3/4 of its total exports. Energy accounted for 30%, and manufacturing contributed about 15% to exports south of the border. Exports to the United States account for about 17.8% of Canada's gross domestic product and more than 2.4 million jobs in Canada. After the latest regulations, American exporters will suddenly face new barriers in the Canadian market. Now, you may ask, what does this lead to? The most obvious answer might be this. Prices will go up on both sides trade, companies will be out of breath, and consumers will have more money in their pockets. But there is also an emotional side to the story. Trudeau's announcement of the decision was framed in terms of protecting the honour of the country. If a country that we have long called a friend hits our economy, we will not sit idly by, the Prime Minister said. This rhetoric has considerable support among the Canadian public. Within hours of the US tariff announcement, a wave of economic patriotism swept Canada. Retailers put Canadian flags on shelves alongside domestically produced goods, and social media began circulating lists of Canadian alternatives to US goods. Prominent politicians of all stripes urged citizens to buy Canadian. Canadian provinces have also responded to the tariffs. Ontario and Nova Scotia said they would withdraw American beer, wine and spirits from government-owned liquor stores. The Premier of British Columbia announced that the province would stop selling alcohol produced in the red provinces. Recent polls also show that the vast majority of Canadians think the Trump administration's moves are unfair. The retaliatory move could therefore create a favourable domestic perception for Trudeau. But how will Washington respond to this retaliation? Could Trump and his team be in a "we didn't expect Canada to respond so violently" mode? Initial comments from the White House suggest that Canada overreacted. On social media, Trump has also been very outspoken, saying, "Canada has abused our trade for years, and now we're getting what we deserve." So how does the tax spat between the two sides affect the economic arena? If we look at the economic analysis, there doesn't seem to be a win-win situation. Customs duties are a kind of wall. When high walls are erected, the flow of goods slows down, prices rise, consumption is curtailed, and producers lose market share. In the short run, some domestic producers may rejoice, saying, "We are protected from competition." But in the long run, reduced trade flows reduce total employment and welfare. In other words, there are many economists who say tariffs are good for nobody. While a break in trade, ties between the two countries is still unlikely. There are scenarios where tensions could increase in the short term. All this also contradicts the USMCA framework. Normally, the USMCA aimed to minimise the customs barriers that these three countries imposed on each other. Now that steps are being taken against the spirit of this agreement, it raises concerns about whether the USMCA will collapse. Some experts say, Trump is using this policy as a bargaining tool, and eventually the deal will be revised. The most important question for the Canadian government is, how long will this retaliation last, and where will it lead? Trudeau's message is, "We are tough, but we have not closed the door to compromise." Some reports suggest that Ottawa has been in contact with Washington through diplomatic delegations and that a solution is being sought in the background. But Trump seems unwilling to give up this trump card easily. "Tariffs are my most powerful weapon. They give me an advantage at the negotiating table." This could mean that tensions will continue in the short term. Historically, the United States and Canada have managed to resolve most of their disputes without escalating into bitter tensions. For the most part, diplomacy between the two countries has taken the form of calm and constructive dialogue. Analysts in the region are surprised to see such an open spiral of, "If you put tariffs on me, I'll put tariffs on you." There have been limited minor tensions over steel, aluminum, or agricultural products before, but a wave of reciprocal sanctions on this scale is rare. What about business and consumers? They are watching the situation with concern. The retaliatory tariffs will mean higher prices for imported goods for Canadian consumers, which could make them more expensive. On the other hand, US companies could lose ground in the Canadian market. If this trade conflict drags on, it is inevitable that border crossings between the US and Canada will be at least partially disrupted, some experts say. This would disrupt the transportation of perhaps thousands of trucks a day and disrupt factory layouts. So triggering a trade war with its allies will not make America stronger. So far, a second Trump presidency has been everything the right could have asked for. The grotesque excesses of the American state are in retreat. The DEI initiatives are over. The funding for the left's political messages is over. But every victory is bought at a price, and the bill for these early successes must now be paid. Trump has long seen tariffs as a tool that serves two sets of purposes. First, to rebalance trade, i.e., close the US trade deficit of nearly $1 trillion and expand US manufacturing. Second, to solve geopolitical problems by threatening to impose tariffs if Mexico does not stop the flow of migrants crossing the border, or by reducing China's global economic influence. Trump announced plans to impose tariffs of 25% on imports from Canada and Mexico, and 10% on goods from China. But whether Trump's goal is to close the trade deficit or reduce China's global economic influence, he will find that using tariffs primarily as leverage is more effective than adopting them as policy. One reason is macroeconomic. Sweeping tariffs will increase costs for American consumers, especially in the short term. Studies show that full implementation of the tariffs Trump threatened during the election campaign would cost a typical American family $2,600 to $3,900 a year. Sweeping tariffs would also have counterintuitive macroeconomic effects. For example, they would encourage the Federal Reserve to keep US interest rates high. This would attract foreign capital to the US and increase the value of the dollar relative to other major currencies, partly mitigating potential consumer price increases. But this would hurt US exporters and workers. The EU, on the other hand, is also in his crosshairs, with the president promising to impose tariffs strictly on a bloc he believes has treated the US terribly. And other tariffs are expected to be imposed on all kinds of medicines and pharmaceuticals, steel and chips. Trump is a businessman at heart, and it is often useful to see his statements through the lens of a real estate mogul involved in negotiations. In the case of Canada and Mexico, what Trump wants is in part greater cooperation in combating illegal immigration and the flow of drugs into the US, and he seems willing to take some economic hits in the short term if it leads to more pressure on his partners. But Trump also has a long-standing obsession with the US trade balance that economists tend to roll their eyes at. The idea that the US loses $200 billion a year to Canada is half a legitimate complaint, half the frustration of supporting allies with defense spending, and half the idea that trade deficits weaken the states. His intention seems to be to support domestic production by raising the cost of imports, and in doing so strengthen the balance of trade. This can prove to be a mistake. A trade deficit with one country says little about a country's overall prosperity, and when countries run deficits in general, it is because of a bloated state rather than a rigged trading system. The idea that government deficits require financing puts pressure on domestic investment and the balance of trade. If Trump wants to achieve net zero imports, he should continue shrinking the state rather than raising barriers to trade. The first Trump tariffs in 2018 were devastating for everyone involved. The US Tax Foundation estimated that action against Canada and Mexico alone would lead to a 0.3% drop in US GDP and the loss of 286,000 jobs, while action against China would result in the loss of another 0.1% of GDP. In return, the US would gain about $100 billion in tax revenues each year. This is hardly a big deal for American taxpayers, even without taking into account the damage these measures could do to the international trade structure, potentially triggering retaliation and weakening the World Trade Organization rules governing interstate trade. This would also be bad news for Britain. We are already in the firing line for a new tax on medicines. We export £8.8 billion worth of medicines to the US every year. A wider trade war would disrupt our economic model and could force Starmer to choose between tighter ties with the EU or a trade deal with the US. There are no prizes for guessing which he will choose or how high the dynamic costs might be. None of this is to say that Trump's tariffs are all bad. There may be arguments in their favour. You might think that an industry shows learning by doing effects, that experience leads to higher performance over time, and that a period of protection can provide time and space for these gains to materialise, or that there are spillovers across industries that can boost productivity enough to offset losses. Trump's focus on manufacturing suggests that this may be at least partly what he has in mind. But the best argument is national security. A trade policy that makes everyone richer doesn't necessarily make you safer. If Xi Jinping offers to build your jets, build your ships, forge your steel and design your microchips, it is perfectly reasonable to say absolutely under no circumstances, even if he offers incredible prices. What is a source of wealth one day turns into a drastic power differential the next day, and a drastic loss of power and prosperity the day after that. If Trump believes that a confrontation with Beijing is likely, tariffs on trade with China and an early partial disengagement make perfect sense. But Trump is not the only leader who will have a say in rewriting the trade order. Washington's trading partners will have to decide whether to negotiate with him or keep digging for a protracted trade war. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum demonstrated this recently when she responded to Trump's tariff threats by both threatening retaliatory tariffs and saying she was ready to call Trump and talk. Still, the president-elect's return to the White House comes at a moment of increasing leverage. The American economy has significantly outperformed its peers in recent years. For example, it has grown 3 times faster than the European Union since the end of 2019. This has made the United States a key market for companies based in partner countries. Trump could use US superiority in artificial intelligence, semiconductor design, and other key technologies as an additional source of influence, guaranteeing that partners who agree to trade terms will have access to cutting-edge chips for AI and other high-tech American products. Countries have little alternative to deal with Trump. Economic growth in China is slowing, making the state a less attractive trading partner. Smaller economies will continue to make deals among themselves, such as the trade agreement Canada and Indonesia signed in early December. But the economic risks of such deals will generally pale in comparison to agreements with the United States, given the much larger scale of the US market. Trump and his team should work to frame trade demands in a way that mobilizes supportive voices abroad. Many European defense officials are calling on their countries to increase defense spending and make other necessary industrial investments. And a growing number of officials across the G-7 support restricting trade with China. Trump can work with these figures for deals. Trump should also remember that results are more important than means in these deals. If Europe and other G-7 allies commit to reducing trade ties with China but want to use their own toolkits to get there, he should not object. But diplomacy to secure successful deals will not be easy, and Trump's fondness for hyperbole could undermine his goals if he goes too far. Well-managed threats can bring foreign governments to the table. But if Trump is too aggressive, his negotiating partners, facing their own domestic political pressures, may have no choice but to pick a fight. This would force the president to impose tariffs that he finds expensive to implement. Moreover, countries will have to know that the deals they make with Trump are here to stay. No one will want to make a deal if they think Trump will come back the next day with more threats. Trump will need to consult closely with Congress and key stakeholders as he details specific trade objectives to reassure foreign partners that deals will likely hold. He can also gain broader support by moving quickly. If Trump manages to secure a few deals quickly, he will build momentum for deals with others. But will there be any new developments between Canada and the US in the coming weeks? For example, Trump could trigger a bigger confrontation with threats such as, "Cancel this retaliatory order," or "We will expand our list and raise the tax rates to 40%. Canada could respond again in a harsh way, or, in an unexpected diplomatic breakthrough, the leaders could meet and reach an agreement to ease the tariff crisis. Many observers believe that both sides could soften for the sake of trade interests. But at what point and under what conditions? That remains unclear. To summarise, this process, sparked by Trudeau's promise that we will also impose a 25% tariff, has become one of the most serious trade tensions between Canada and the United States in decades. As the two close partners set up mutual tariff barricades, the economic cost and political repercussions are growing. Yet, despite the harsh rhetoric, the door to dialogue is not completely closed. Either everyone rolls back the tariffs after a short-lived bargain and a deal is done, or this new tension will evolve into a more protracted trade conflict. For now, both sides are signalling resolve, but the future of North America depends on how these negotiations play out. Thank you for following.